Hey everyone, it's Void. Before we get things started, I want to give you all huge thanks for being here. I hope your summers are off to an amazing start, and thank you for tuning in. Let's take a look at Zurzoth Chaos Rider. Zurzoth is a 2/3 devil for 2 and a red that says, whenever an opponent draws their first card each turn, if it's not their turn, you create a 1/1 red devil creature token. With this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. He also has, whenever one or more devils you control attack one or more players, you and those players each draw a card. Then discard a card at random. Zurzoth is a mono red commander, and if you haven't played mono colored decks before, it does mean that the deck faces some limitations, such as limited access to cards. However, mono red is known for one thing: aggression. This deck will come online fast and hard, getting tons of devils and being able to ping your opponents and their creatures for damage. His first ability generates us devils that ping damage when they die, and directly brings us into our second ability, where when we attack with those devils, we get more devils, and even though they might die, we don't really care if they die or not because we will be getting them right back. In some cases, we will actually want them to die so we can ping whatever we want for 1 damage. This deck is really fun. It's a little wacky and it's certainly chaotic, and I can't wait to dive into this with you all. First of all, let's take a look at our strategy. This deck's goal is to get as many devils as possible and then swing out with them to chip away at our opponent's health. This number of damage dealt may be done in small increments, but after a while it really starts to heavily add up. Our first core strategy is to make our opponents draw cards. Now this might seem a little counterintuitive at first, but we really need to get this done to accomplish our deck strategy. Most of this will be done by attacking with our devils. However, we want to have ways to get even more devils when it's our opponent's turn as well. That way we won't only be generating devils on our turn. This is done by utilizing cards that will typically make all players draw a card, which yes, can help them, but we will also be utilizing cards that make them discard their cards as well, making it a lot less helpful. Then comes our second strategy, ping. Ping is a slang term in Magic that simply means to deal 1 damage. I know what you're probably thinking: 1 damage isn't going to win us games, and you're right, 1 damage won't win games. Pinging 1 damage 40 times, however, can win games. We will be pinging our opponents in all sorts of different ways, whether it be playing cards, discarding cards, creating more devils, or punishing players for using things that we give them. This leads into our third and final strategy, ping harder. When looking at this strategy, we will be focusing on cards that either make our pings deal more damage, think double or even triple, or just straight up doing damage to each opponent for doing nothing but playing the game. This will likely be how we win the game, turning our measly 1 damage into 2, 3, or even 6 damage. Now, just a reminder if you're new here, first of all, welcome, but second of all, I won't be covering every card on this deck list. I found covering every card tends to be a waste of time. Nobody really needs to know what a Soul Ring does in order to operate this deck, so even though Soul Ring is included in the list, it won't be covered in this video. I choose to only cover the essentials to make things as concise as possible. Now, before we get into our first strategy, I want to remind you all that the goal of these cards is to make our opponents draw cards on turns other than our own, or disrupt them by making them discard their hands to draw new cards, or wheeling as it is known in Magic terms. For those who are unaware, Wheel refers to Wheel of Fortune. No, not the TV show, a classic Magic card that makes all players discard their hands and draw 7 new cards. This card is very expensive and thus why it isn't in this deck, but when you hear Wheel Effect, it's referring to the effect of discarding and drawing back up. First up is Burning Inquiry. For 1 red, we have each player draw 3 cards, then discard 3 at random. This is a sorcery, meaning we can only do it on our turn, however this can be a great way to get devils on the board. Once we have devils on the board, this won't be as helpful just because we can attack with them to get more, but if we are saving for blockers and don't want to swing out, or we're in a spot where we don't have other devils on the board yet, this is a great way to do it. In addition to that, it's also a way to disrupt our opponent's game plans. They may have a card they are saving to win the game with, and this could cause them to discard it. Next up is Gyre Reach Sanitarium, which is actually a land. For 2 mana, we can tap this land, and each player draws and discards a card. We can do this on an opponent's turn as well, granting us extra devils. Typically, I would just leave this in the lands category, but since it contributes to such an integral part of our strategy, I wanted to mention it. This is a great card because it's free, grants us mana, and can be used to get more devils if we need it. Then we have Howling Golem. Howling Golem is a 2/3 golem for 3 colorless that makes each player draw a card when it attacks or blocks. We need to be careful with this card, because if we attack with it, we may accidentally help our opponents out. The only time I would actually attack with this card is if you have no other way to gain devils, or if you are trying to get blockers up. The reason for this is, if you swing with other devils, you're getting more devils regardless, so we don't need to give our opponents an extra card on top of that. The main purpose for Howling Golem is to block with. Yes, it will still help our opponents, but we can do it on someone else's turn, granting us 3 more devils, and we get a card as well. Just remember to be careful to not help your opponents with this one. Then we have Incendiary Command. For 3 and 2 red, we get a sorcery that lets us choose of 2 of 4 options. We can deal 4 damage to a player, deal 2 damage to each creature, destroy a non-basic land, or have everyone discard their hand and draw up to how many cards they had. We will be wanting to use this last ability, then we can use whatever other ability works for us best at the time. The last ability is a key one here because it makes our opponents draw cards, and it adds to the chaos of this deck. If someone has a card in their hand they've been threatening everyone with, we can get rid of it with this card. Remember though, we only get devils for the first card our opponents draw, so we only get 1 per opponent, not 7 per opponent. This card can also be used as a pseudo board wipe, which can be really helpful in certain situations. Then we have Korvath's Fury. For 4 and a red, we get a sorcery that lets us choose friend or foe for each opponent. Friends discard their hand and draw up to their old hand size +1, and foes take damage equal to cards in their hand. For certain decks, this second ability can be amazing, however you'll typically want to use it for its first ability for its wheel effect. Magus of the Wheel is a 3/3 human wizard for 2 and a red that has pay 1 and a red and tap it and sack it. Then each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. Going off of what I said about Wheel of Fortune, this card is a direct reference to it, literally called Magus of the Wheel. We can use this effect on an opponent's turn, so that is likely when we want to do it, unless we just want to gain blockers up and don't want to swing with our devils. Mikakoro Center of the Sea is the second land on this list. That also allows us to pay 2 to make each player draw a card. This one doesn't make opponents discard cards, however, we can still use this on an opponent's turn to make us get more devils. Molten Psyche is a sorcery for 1 and 2 red that wheels opponents back up to their previous hand size. It also has Metalcraft, where if we control 3 artifacts, it does damage equal to the cards drawn. This deck isn't necessarily an artifact deck, so we won't be expecting to be able to utilize it, but it can still be really cool when it works out. Otherworld Atlas is a very helpful artifact for 4 colorless that allows us to tap it and put a charge counter on it. Then we can tap it again to have everyone draw a card for each counter on it. Again, play this on other players' turns, and probably only ever get this up to 1 card, since that's what we will benefit the most from it. Temple Bell is a simple artifact. For 3 we tap it, everyone draws a card. Very simple, but very effective. Wheel of Misfortune is a pseudo-wheel effect where each player secretly chooses any number 0 or greater, then the player with the highest number takes damage equal to their number, the lowest number gets away lucky, and then the other 2 players get wheeled. Finally, we get the Zenith Chronicler. For 2 colorless, we get a 3/1 artifact creature that makes each other player draw a card when someone plays a multicolored spell. This won't be going off on our turn, but can be a good way to get devils on other players' turns. Then we get to our next strategy, Ping. First up is Brawlin, Sky Shark Raider. Brawlin is a 3/3 human shaman for 3 and a red that says, whenever you discard a red, put a 1/1 on him and deal 1 damage to each opponent. There aren't any sharks in our deck, nor is Shabraz his partner in this deck, so we can ignore the first and third part of his text. If you recall back to our commander, when we attack with devils, we draw then and randomly discard a card. This will mean that we can ping an opponent for an extra damage, and Brawlin will get very strong very fast. Then is Calvasade of Calamity. For 1 and a red, we get an enchantment that does 1 damage to each creature we attack with that has power 1 or less. This will mean all of our devils will automatically do 1 damage to our opponents when we attack with them. Dance with Devils is an instant for 3 and a red that gets us 2 devils for free. This can be really good since it's a 4 mana and our commander is 3, so we can play this on the turn after we play our commander so long as we didn't miss a land step. Glenhorn Buccaneer is a 2/4 Minotaur Pirate for 1 and 2 red that has haste. It also says whenever we discard a card we do 1 damage to each opponent, which again happens when Zurzoth's second ability resolves. We can also pay 1 red to discard a card if Glinthorn Buccaneer is attacking. Goblin Bombardment is a classic staple red card. For 1 and a red, we get an enchantment that lets us sack a creature to deal 1 damage to any target. If we sack a devil with this, we do 2 damage to any target because of their ability. Hellrider is a 3/3 devil with haste that automatically does 1 damage to any opponent or planeswalker we are attacking. Since this is a devil, we can also use it to trigger Zurzoth's ability by attacking with it. Hissing Iguanar is a 3/1 lizard for 2 and a red that deals 1 damage to target player or planeswalker when a creature dies. This triggers when any creature dies, so we can count it off other opponents' creatures as well. Outpost Siege is an enchantment for 3 and a red that lets us choose between Khans or Dragons. If we choose Khans, exile the top card of our library and can play it until the next of each of our turns. If we choose Dragons, we deal 1 damage to any target whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield. If we are struggling for card draw, we may choose Khans, but we will typically choose Dragons to ping for more damage. Pain Distributor is a 2/3 Devil Citizen for 2 and a red that has Menace. It also gives our opponents treasures as they play their first spell, but whenever they use it, they get pinged for damage. Be careful when playing this because it can oftentimes help them more than it hurts them, but it will undoubtedly add to the never-ending ping train. Raid Bombardment is an enchantment for 2 and a red that, like cards earlier, will automatically do 1 damage to an opponent or planeswalker when we attack with one of our weak creatures. Spiteful Prankster is a 3/2 devil for 2 and a red that has first strike on our turn. It also does 1 damage to a target player or planeswalker whenever another creature dies. Again, this is any creature on the board, not just our own. And it's a devil, so we can use it for Zurzoth's ability as well. Witty Roastmaster is a 3/2 Devil Citizen for 2 and a red that has Alliance. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, it does 1 damage to each opponent. This should be at least 3 per turn, as we will hopefully be getting devils on the battlefield like crazy. Then we get to Zariel, Archduke of Avernus. Zariel is a planeswalker with starting loyalty 4. For 1, we get to +1/0 our creatures and give them haste until end of turn. For 0, we get another devil, and for -6, we get an additional combat phase. 0 is a great way to get 1 more devil on the board, and we can uptick them at instant speed, meaning after blockers are declared, we can give our attackers +1 attack in order to potentially kill some of our opponent's blockers that only have 2 health. Then we get to our third and final strategy, Ping Harder. City on Fire is an enchantment for 5 and 3 red that has Convoke, which means we can tap our creatures to pay 1 generic mana of the spell's cost. Once we play it, it makes all of our damage tripled, which means that we can now ping for 3 damage instead of 1. Then we get the Comet Storm, which has multi-kicker 1, which means we can pay an extra colorless to kick the spell. Each time we do kick it, we may choose a new target, and each X value we pay does X damage to each of them. This is more of a removal spell in a lot of ways, but since we can do damage to each opponent, I decided to include it here anyways. Then comes another red staple card. Impact Tremors is an enchantment for 1 and a red that deals 1 damage to each opponent when we have a creature enter the battlefield. This will hopefully do 3 damage a turn when we have Devers enter the battlefield due to Zurzoth's ability. Mechanized Warfare is an enchantment for 1 and 2 red that makes all of our damage deal normal damage +1. For our pings, this will be double damage, going from 1 to 2. This can really speed things up in a quick, tight match. Price of Progress is another technically not a ping ability, but for 1 and a red we'll deal damage equal to twice the number of non-basic lands someone controls. This could be an excellent finisher, and as most commander decks are not monocolored, there will be quite a few non-basic lands out by the late game. Torben Thane of Redfell is another classic red card. For 1 and 3 red, we get a 2/4 Dwarf Noble that deals damage equal to our normal damage +2. This will turn our 1 pings into 3 pings, which will hurt our enemies for a lot. And finally, we get to our last card on this list. Vicious Shadows is an enchantment for 6 and a red that deals damage to our opponents equal to the cards in their hand when a creature dies. This will ping them for a lot of damage typically, as we will constantly be wheeling their hands and making them draw cards. Anyways, that will wrap up this week's deck list. I had a lot of fun brewing this deck as it's super unique and lets us stray away from a traditional Magic deck. Before I go, I just want to give another shout out to each and every one of you for being here and tuning into my content. Making these videos is not easy for me, so it really means a lot to see my work making you all happy. If you have a commander you would like to see me cover, please leave them in the comments, and they may be featured in weeks to come. I have no stopping point in sight, so make sure to sub for weekly budget deck packs, and as always, stay cool y'all. Peace out.